Hello guys, this is Nacho Heredia Matthias from www.learningalias.co.uk. This is the first video on how to use the interface. Here I'm using Alias 2020, but these videos are also useful for previous versions. I'm going to put on my windows here so we can see all the viewports. Here normally we have the four viewports here at the top view, the left view, perspective view for viewing the 3D model, and the back view. So if you press this button here on the right hand side, you can maximize your viewport, and you can do this in all the viewports, and you can minimize it again, and we can see all the viewports again. Here I'm maximizing my perspective. Okay, let's see our palettes. Here we have the main palette. Here we have all the tools available in Alias. Here we have the shelves. This is important because with the shelves we can customize our shelf, so we can bring any tool we have in the palette and throw it to the shelf. Here we have the diagnostic shade palette. Here with the first button we can choose the wireframe shade mode. We can see through the model. This second is the solid shade mode, so we can see all our surfaces in one color. The third mode is the multi-random color shader. We can see each surface in a different color, so we can see better our patch layout. This one here is the silver stripes shade mode, so we can check better how the highlights are flowing in our model. Very useful too to see the highlights running through. This one is the ISO angle. It's more advanced, but to see the highlights too. But I prefer to use this one to see the reflections and highlights on our model. This one here is the Shade Guide mode. We have different options here. Normally this shader is in the Shade Guide mode here. Okay, we change this parameter to Shade Sky. We can see our environment reflecting. If we turn off the model, we can see better the reflections too. Sometimes it's useful to change it to the double horizon so we can better see the reflections in our model. We can be using all these shaders in combination, so we can change from one to another and check our model in any time. Another important option in our shaders is the transparency option, so we can change it so we can see through our model. And if we're using blueprints, we can see if we're doing well with the blueprints in all the viewports. So we can do this transparency option in any shader we're using. So if I pick this one, I can change the transparency and get an X-ray mode shader like. And if we came back to any shader, we can set the transparency back to 0 again and get our solid model again, right? So that's our main shaders we're going to be using in Alias all the time. Another very important tool is the control panel, mostly because we have here an option. If we turn on the controls for the surface, let's say, okay, we can see the degrees and the spans for that surface and for the curves too. So we can use this control panel to change easily the degree and the spans of our surface or our curves. Yeah, so that's our main toolbars, and as you can see, we can move them around to change the layout as we're working. If we accidentally close the palette, if we go to Windows, we can reset the palette again and bring it back. The same happens with the shelves. If we close this toolbar, if we close the diagnostic shade palette, instead of going to the Windows, we can go here to Object Display and pick the diagnostic shading. So that will bring our toolbar again. If we close the control panel, we go to Windows 2 and pick on control panel, and we'll bring that back again. Layers are very important too. As you can see in this model, I have a lot of layers here. So this is useful to reorder and organize all our surfaces and objects in our model, so we can change anytime from one layer to another the objects in the scene. Very useful tool. We'll see in next videos. Here, for example, I have my center surface layer. With this button, I can turn the layer off and on, so I want in any time in my model, so I can see what I have inside. I'm gonna review a little bit the palette. Here we have all the tools in Alias. I can click on these buttons and close all the sub palettes we have here. We have all the tools. If I close everything, this will be the layout. Here in the big palette, we have all the tools for picking objects, surfaces, curves and surfaces, different objects. In the transform palette, we can do basic transforms like move, rotate, and scale, and other stuff with our basic, apart from our basic transforms. Here we have some tools for painting. In Alias, you can do sketching as if you were using Photoshop, but this is intended to be a 3D basic, so I'm not covering these tools now. The next one is the curve palette. This is the very important palette because here we can draw our curves. We can do simple shapes like circles, different types of curves. Here is the curve tool. We can do different types of curves and degrees. We can do with this one simple shapes like lines, rectangles, circles, arcs, for example, all these type of basic shapes. With curves, we can create 1 degree, 3 degree, 5 degree, and different degrees of curves too. The curve edit palette is used for editing your curves. You can do different types of things with this, like planarize, project your curves, duplicate on your curves. In the object edit palette, we can perform some general modifications of our curves and surface, like extending, aligning, using symmetrical tools, offsetting our cursors or surfaces, and different types of transformations or surfaces. Okay, don't worry too much about this. I'm naming the tools in general. We will see more in depth. In the surface palette, we have all the tools for creating our surfaces. We have rails, planar surfaces, revolvings, do transitions with the skins, perform fillets or blends, do rounds, all the different tools we have for performing with our surfaces and creating surfaces. In the surface edit palette, we can perform some operations like projecting curves on surfaces, use a trim tool and then trim tool to do some trimming. And we can use, for example, the intersect tool to calculate intersections between 2 or more surfaces and other stuff for editing our surfaces. Here we have the subdivision palette inside Alias. This is for doing polygon modeling all inside Alias. This is available only in version 2020. In the mesh palette, we have all the tools for working with meshes, and we're doing reverse engineering. The construction sub-palette is used for creating construction planes, so we can create more accurate geometry. These are help us to try to build our curves more accurate. We can use points too, so we can support curves from these points. In the Locators panel, we have the curvature graph. This is for creating graphs for our curves and our surfaces to see how the curvature is going. And also with this other button here, we can measure distances, radius, diameters, and angles between curves. Very useful too for measuring. In the evaluate panel, we have this very useful and very often used tool. Is the continuity evaluation between surfaces. We can choose to calculate G0 positional continuity, G1 tangency continuity, or G2 curvature continuity between our surfaces, and ask the program to tell us if we're reaching those continuities. Now I'm going to explain how to navigate our viewports. If I press Shift Alt with my right mouse button in my mouse and I go up and down with it, I do a zoom in my viewport. If I do Shift Alt with my middle mouse button, I do panning in my viewport. It's also useful for the other 2D viewports or orthographic viewports we have, the same for all. If I go to my 3D viewport, maximize it, if I press Shift Alt with the left mouse button, I do an orbit around my model, okay? If I press with the middle mouse button, I do my panning, and if I press with the right mouse button, I do the zooming in my model. Now, if I press Shift Alt and click with the left mouse button in any surface or curve in our model, and as you can see, I changed these 3 little axes here. What this is going to do is reset the orbit center on my model. So we can do this anytime we want while we are modeling to reset the zoom in. As you can see now, the model rotates from that position. If we are in wireframe mode, we can pick any surface, although we don't see them, and reset this point too. Let's talk about shelves. Shelves are important to customize the most often tools we have. As you can see, we here have different sub palettes. I can have as many as we want with the tools I most often use. Here I have the main, I have all the sub palettes like the surface palette. Here I have all the tools related to my surfaces. I have the evaluate palette with the surface continuity here and all the different shaders I used. And here I have all the subdivision palette entirely. This is really useful because I don't have to be going all the time to the palette and open a sub palette. So in this way we lose a lot of time. So customizing these shelves with our tools is very, very useful. Here I have a new shelf. Let's say I pick this tool. If I use the middle mouse button, pick that tool and drag it to the shelf, I can bring that tool to the shelf. So I can do that with any tool of the palette. So for example, if I pick any tool of the surface, I can drag them on the palette. If I make a mistake and I don't want this tool, I can drag it to the trash and I delete it from the shelf. Okay. If you want to rearrange any tool on the shelf, if you drag it and move it to the next, you can reorder all the tools in your palette. If you have created a new shelf, you can press with the right mouse button here and say self set, and then you can give it a name you want. Here you can press save and save that as a file to use in your computer or in any other computer. So whenever you open Alias again, you will have your self set customized and open with the latest shelf you had. You can save your preference whenever you want. Go into Preference, User Preferences, and Save Preference with any change you've made to your UI. Okay. That's all for now. I hope you find it useful and see you in the next video.